I'm Isaiah Carter, 28, and I spent 7 years behind bars for a crime I didn't commit, killing a police officer. The judge sentenced me to life, and everyone believed I was a cold-blooded cop killer. But I knew the truth. I was defending my life that night when Officer Stevens cornered me in that alley. For years, I fought a system that had already decided my fate, clinging to hope that somewhere, somehow, evidence existed that would prove what really happened in those terrifying moments. What I discovered buried in police files would not only set me free, it would expose a conspiracy that went deeper than I ever imagined. If you've ever felt powerless against a system designed to silence you, like and subscribe for more stories of truth prevailing against all odds. The bloody torn shirt still haunts my dreams. It sits in an evidence box somewhere, a silent witness to the night that stole my life. October 15, 2016. I can recall every detail with painful clarity. I was 21 then, working the graveyard shift at Henderson's Auto Parts warehouse to pay for community college. My shift ended at 2 a.m., and I was walking the 6 blocks home through the industrial district when I heard footsteps behind me. The alley between Mason and 3rd Street had always been a shortcut I'd taken hundreds of times before. "Hey you," the voice was sharp, commanding. I turned to see Officer Stevens emerging from the shadows. Even in the dim streetlight, I could see something was wrong. His uniform was disheveled, his eyes had that glassy look I'd seen on my uncle during his drinking binges. "Yes, sir?" I kept my hands visible, my voice respectful. My mother had drilled into me the importance of never giving police a reason to escalate. "What are you doing out here?" Stevens stepped closer, and I caught the unmistakable smell of alcohol on his breath. "Just walking home from work, officer." I showed him my warehouse badge, the one clipped to my torn shirt. "I get off at 2. Stevens grabbed my arm roughly. "Don't get smart with me, boy. You fit the description of someone who's been dealing drugs in this area." My heart hammered against my ribs. "I don't know anything about drugs, sir. I just work at Henderson's." "Turn around and put your hands on the wall." His grip tightened, fingers digging into my bicep hard enough to bruise. I complied, pressing my palms against the cold brick wall. Stevens kicked my feet apart and began searching me aggressively, his hands invasive and rough. When he found nothing, his frustration became palpable. "You're lying to me?" Stevens spun me around, his face inches from mine. "I know you're dealing. Where's your stash?" "I don't have any drugs," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can search me all you want." That's when Stevens shoved me hard against the wall. My head struck the brick, and stars exploded behind my eyes. The taste of blood filled my mouth. "You think you're smart?" Stevens pulled out his baton. "I'll beat the truth out of you." The first blow caught me across the ribs, and pain shot through my chest. I doubled over, gasping, "Please, I'm telling the truth." The second blow struck my shoulder, and I heard something crack. Stevens was breathing heavily now, his face twisted with rage that had nothing to do with me. I was just a convenient target for whatever demons he was fighting. "Fight back," he taunted, raising the baton again. "Come on, resist arrest, give me a reason." I realized then that Stevens didn't plan to let me walk away. In his drunk, unhinged state, he was going to beat me to death in this alley. No witnesses, no cameras, just his word against a dead man's silence. When he raised the baton for what I knew would be the killing blow, my body moved on pure instinct. I grabbed his wrist and twisted, trying to get the weapon away from him. We struggled, both of us grunting with effort. Stevens was stronger, but I was fighting for my life. The baton clattered to the ground. Stevens reached for his gun. "No." I lunged forward, and we crashed into the brick wall together. His head struck the corner with a sickening crack. Stevens crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath his skull. I stood there, shaking, my torn shirt soaked with sweat and blood, his and mine. I should have called 911 immediately. Instead, I panicked and ran home, convinced no one would believe a young black man's word against a dead police officer's reputation. The Miranda rights card they showed me was crumpled and bloodstained, not from Stevens' blood, but from my own busted lip when they slammed me against the squad car. 3 days had passed since that night in the alley. 3 days of jumping. At every knock on the door, every siren in the distance, they came for me at dawn on October 18th. I was eating breakfast with my mother when the front door exploded inward. 6 officers in tactical gear stormed through our small apartment like we were harboring a terrorist. "Isaiah Carter, you're under arrest for the murder of Officer James Stevens," the lead detective announced, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. My mother screamed. The bowl of cereal slipped from my hands, shattering on the linoleum floor. This was the moment I'd been dreading, but the reality was so much worse than my nightmares. They threw me to the ground before I could even stand up, my face pressed against the sticky kitchen floor while they cuffed my hands behind my back. The metal bit into my wrists, and I could hear my mother sobbing somewhere above me. "You have the right to remain silent," the detective began, but his words were lost in the chaos of my mother's pleas and my own thundering heartbeat. "Please, he's a good boy," my mother kept saying. "He wouldn't hurt anyone. There's been a mistake." The detective holding the blood-stained Miranda card looked at her with barely concealed contempt. "Ma'am, your son beat a police officer to death with his own baton. There's no mistake here. That wasn't true." I wanted to scream it, to tell them what really happened, but the words stuck in my throat. They hauled me to my feet, and I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the hallway. Mirror my face was a mask of terror and disbelief. The perp walk was a nightmare. News vans lined the street, reporters shouting questions I couldn't process. Camera flashes exploded in my face as they pushed me toward the squad car. Someone in the crowd yelled, "Cop killer," and I flinched as if struck. The ride to the station was silent except for the crackle of the radio. I sat in the back seat, staring at the mesh screen separating me from the officers in front. They hadn't said a word to me since the arrest, but I could feel their hatred radiating through the car. At the station, they processed me like a piece of meat. Fingerprints, mugshots, the humiliating strip search. Every officer I encountered looked at me with the same expression: disgust, mixed with barely restrained violence. I was no longer Isaiah Carter, college student and warehouse worker. I was the man who killed one of their own. The holding cell was a concrete box with a metal toilet and a narrow bench. They threw me inside and slammed the door with a sound that echoed through my bones. For the first time since the arrest, I was alone with my thoughts. I thought about calling my father, but what would I say? How could I explain that I'd killed a police officer in what I claimed was self-defense? How could I make anyone understand that Stevens had been trying to kill me? The news coverage was relentless. From the small television in the common area, I watched reporters describe me as a violent criminal and a cop killer. They showed my high school yearbook photo next to Stevens' official police portrait. The contrast was stark: him in his crisp uniform, me looking like a scared kid. Stevens was posthumously hailed as a hero. The police union president gave a press conference about the dangerous criminals who prey on officers trying to keep the community safe. The mayor promised a swift trial and justice for the fallen officer. No one mentioned Stevens' drinking problem, or his history of excessive force complaints. No one talked about the young man who'd been fighting for his life in that alley. The narrative was already written, and I was the villain. My mother visited me in jail, her eyes red from crying. She'd aged years in just a few days, and I knew this was destroying her. "I believe you," she whispered through the thick glass. "I know you wouldn't hurt anyone unless you had to." But belief wasn't enough. I needed evidence, witnesses, something to prove that Stevens had been the aggressor. Instead, I had a dead police officer and a city that wanted my blood. The first betrayal came from people I'd considered friends. Classmates from community college gave interviews painting me as angry and violent. Former coworkers at the warehouse suddenly remembered incidents that cast me in a sinister light. Even my girlfriend Sarah distanced herself from me. The second betrayal came from the system itself. The public defender assigned to my case was Janet Morrison, a tired woman with too many cases and too little time. She met with me for 15 minutes and declared the case challenging. "The evidence is overwhelming," she said, flipping through my file without really looking at me. "We should consider a plea deal." I stared at her in disbelief. A plea deal? I defended myself. Stevens was trying to kill me. She sighed heavily. "That's going to be very difficult to prove. A plea might get you life with the possibility of parole instead of death." Death. The word hung in the air between us like a physical weight. I was 21 years old, and they were talking about executing me for the crime of not wanting to die. The case file with missing pages should have been my first warning about Janet Morrison. When she opened it during our second meeting, papers scattered across the metal tables and police reports. Witness statements, but clearly missing crucial documents. "Sorry," Morrison muttered, gathering the papers. "I'm handling 47 cases right now." 47. I was one of 47 people whose lives depended on her overworked schedule. Morrison was in her 50s, graying hair and a ponytail, glasses held together with tape. She looked defeated before we even started. "Tell me about that night," she said, barely looking up. I told her everything: Steven's drunken behavior, his unprovoked violence. The moment I realized he was going to kill me, Morrison scribbled notes occasionally, but wasn't really listening. "Any witnesses?" she asked when I finished. "Not that I know of." "Security cameras?" It was an alley behind warehouses. She nodded like this confirmed her worst fears. "The prosecution has Stevens' partner testifying that Stevens was responding to a drug complaint." "That's not true. Stevens was drunk and looking for a fight." Morrison finally looked up. "Can you prove he was intoxicated?" "There should be an autopsy report showing his blood alcohol level." She made a note, but I could see she didn't expect it to help. "Isaiah, juries don't like cop killers. Even if Stevens was drinking, convincing 12 people you were justified will be nearly impossible. So what are you saying? We should focus on mitigation, maybe life instead of death." That was when I understood I was truly alone. Morrison wasn't going to investigate Stevens' background or challenge the prosecution's narrative. She was going to plead me out and move on. Over the following weeks, Morrison went through the motions. She requested discovery but didn't follow up when documents were delayed. She interviewed character witnesses but didn't prepare them properly. She hired a forensic expert who recommended a plea deal after one look at crime scene photos. Most damaging was her failure to investigate Stevens himself. I kept telling her something was wrong with the officer that night, begging her to check his personnel file for complaints or disciplinary actions. That's not how this works, she explained. We can't put the victim on trial. But if he has a history of violence, the judge won't allow character assassination of the victim. The prosecution, meanwhile, built a fortress around their version of events. They had Stevens' partner testifying. The officer was responding to a legitimate complaint. They had forensic evidence and my flight from the scene as consciousness of guilt. 3 months before trial, Morrison presented a plea agreement, voluntary manslaughter, 15 to 25 years. It's a good deal considering the circumstances, she said. I stared at the document that would steal decades of my life. I didn't commit voluntary manslaughter. I defended myself. A jury might not see it that way. They might if you actually presented a defense. Morrison's face hardened. I'm doing the best I can. What about Stevens' autopsy? His blood alcohol level? The report shows .08 legally drunk, but not necessarily incapacitating. Finally, evidence supporting my story. That proves he was intoxicated. It proves he'd been drinking. It doesn't prove he was the aggressor. I pushed the plea agreement back. I won't sign this. I won't admit to something I didn't do. Morrison gathered her papers. Then we go to trial. But you're rolling the dice with your life. They're seeking the death penalty. As she left, I stared at the case file with its obvious gaps. Morrison was right about one thing. I was rolling the dice with my life. But I was doing it with loaded dice. And the house always wins. The guilty verdict document burns in my memory. We, the jury, find the defendant Isaiah Carter guilty of murder in the first degree. 12 words that destroyed my life. Preceded by 3 months of trial that broke my spirit. The courtroom was packed daily. Stevens' family sat front row, his widow wearing his badge. Behind them, rows of uniformed officers served as a silent jury. Media filled the gallery, documenting my destruction. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh was ambitious, using my case as her stepping stone to higher office. In her opening, she painted me as a violent criminal who murdered a hero. Officer James Stevens was a decorated 12-year veteran. Walsh told the jury he had a wife, 2 children, and a spotless record. While investigating drug activity, he encountered the defendant. What followed was a brutal, unprovoked attack that cost a good man his life. The prosecution built their case on compelling lies. They presented Stevens as a dedicated officer responding to a legitimate complaint. His partner, Officer Bradley, testified that Stevens was sober and professional that night. The forensic evidence was devastating. Crime scene photos showed Stevens' body in the alley, blood pooling around his head. The medical examiner testified he died from blunt force trauma. They argued I'd deliberately smashed his head against the wall in rage. My flight from the scene became evidence of guilt. Why would an innocent man run? Morrison's cross-examination was weak. She didn't challenge Bradley's testimony or present evidence of Stevens' drinking problem. She didn't even mention the .08 blood alcohol level. When Morrison called character witnesses, their words felt hollow against a dead police officer. She put me on the stand against my judgment. I told my story: Stevens' aggression, his drunken rage, my desperate fight for survival. Walsh's cross-examination was brutal, twisting my words, making my fears sound like anger. You're telling this jury that a trained officer couldn't defend himself against a college student, she asked. I'm telling them he was drunk and violent and trying to kill me. And your solution was to bash his head against a brick wall. My solution was to not die in that alley. Walsh smiled coldly. No further questions. The prosecution's closing was masterful. Walsh reminded the jury, I was a young black man with anger issues based on one high school fight. She painted Stevens as a family man and hero, cut down by someone who chose violence over compliance. The defendant wants you to believe a decorated officer suddenly became homicidal for no reason, Walsh said. But evidence shows Stevens was doing his job when he encountered a drug dealer who chose to fight rather than submit. I wasn't a drug dealer. There was no evidence of that, but Walsh had planted the seed. Morrison's closing was a disaster. She seemed tired, defeated, going through motions of a defense she didn't believe. The defendant admits causing Officer Stevens' death, she said, but he asks you to believe he had no choice, that he was fighting for his life. The jury deliberated 6 hours. When they returned, their faces were grim. The foreman stood, a middle-aged white man who avoided eye contact throughout trial. We find the defendant, Isaiah Carter, guilty of murder in the first degree. The courtroom erupted. Stevens' family sobbed with relief. Officers nodded approval. My mother's scream pierced through the noise. I felt nothing. I'd expected this verdict. 3 weeks later, Judge Patricia Hawkins sentenced me to life without parole, calling my crime particularly heinous and an assault on law and order. As they led me away in shackles, I caught one last glimpse of the courtroom. Prosecutors were shaking hands, congratulating each other. Morrison was packing her files, moving to the next case. Officers were filing out, duty complete. I was 21, and my life was over. The guilty verdict would follow me to prison, a permanent reminder of the night I chose to survive and the system that punished me for it. The letter from my mother was worn and faded from constant handling, her shaky handwriting aged by stress. My dearest Isaiah, I hope this finds you staying strong. I know you're innocent, baby. Don't let them break you. You're coming home too. Me. I read those words every night on my narrow bunk in cell block D. They were my lifeline, my reminder that someone still believed, but they also broke my heart because I knew she was lying to herself about me coming home. Riverside State Penitentiary was designed to break spirits. Gray walls, stale air, constant noise, shouting, clanging metal, echoing footsteps. Being a cop killer made me a target. Guards made sure everyone knew what I was in for my first week. 3 inmates jumped me in the showers, beating me with soap-filled socks while calling themselves law and order. Guards took their time responding. When they arrived, they wrote it up as a minor altercation. I spent 4 days in the infirmary. Dr. Peterson cleaned my wounds and offered advice. You need to find a crew, someone to watch your back. Otherwise, you won't last 6 months. Finding allies was like navigating a minefield. I spent my first month alone walking the yard, eating at empty tables, trying to become invisible. The break came when Tommy Rodriguez approached me in the library. Small and wiry with intelligent eyes, Tommy had been inside 8 years. You're the cop killer, he said. I'm the guy who defended himself, I replied. Tommy laughed. I like that. Most guys wear their crimes like badges. Tommy had been wrongfully convicted of armed robbery. He'd given up on legal remedies and focused on survival. He introduced me to his crew: Marcus Book Washington, a former lawyer serving life; Danny Chen, who'd killed his abusive stepfather; Jose Martinez, a reformed gang member. They weren't saints, but they were loyal. In prison, that was more valuable than innocence. I learned to navigate this brutal hierarchy through careful observation. Never back down from a fight, but never start one. Share commissary items. Keep your head down during count. Follow unwritten rules that kept peace. Nights were hardest. In the darkness, with Walter snoring below me, I'd replay that alley over and over. I'd think about Stephen's family, their pain, my mother working double shifts for appeals. Sarah, who'd stopped writing after the first month. Sometimes I wondered if I should have let Stevens kill me. At least then I'd be the victim, not the villain. My family would mourn a son who died young, not one who became a killer. But then I'd remember the fear in Stephen's eyes when I fought back, and I knew I'd made the right choice. The letters from home reminded me of the life I'd lost: family gatherings, my cousin's graduation, milestones I'd never experience. But they also reminded me I wasn't forgotten. Somewhere outside these walls, people still believed in Isaiah Carter, the college student who'd worked nights for his education. I held on to that belief like a drowning man holds driftwood. It was all I had left. The law books with handwritten notes became my Bible. Marcus Book Washington gave them to me 6 months into my sentence. Legal texts, filled with his careful annotations. Every page was a lesson, every highlighted passage a potential weapon. Book was a former defense attorney before cocaine destroyed his career and led to the murder that put him in Riverside for life. At 55, he commanded respect even in prison stripes. The law is like a foreign language, he told me in the library. Most people, including lawyers, only speak it well enough to get by. But if you want to use it as a weapon, you need fluency. Book had been studying law for 8 years, helping other inmates navigate appeals. He'd overturned 3 convictions and reduced dozens of sentences. Your case is different, he said, sliding a legal pad across the table. Most men I help are guilty of something, but you're actually innocent. The word hung in the air like a prayer. Innocent. First time anyone had said it without doubt. I spent 2 hours recounting my case: Morrison's inadequate defense, the prosecution's lies, evidence never presented. Book took notes, asking pointed questions. Your lawyer never investigated Stevens' background. She said it wasn't admissible. Bullshit. If Stevens had excessive force complaints, drinking problems, behavioral issues all relevant to self-defense. Book pulled out a legal text on ineffective assistance of counsel. This is your ticket out. If we prove Morrison's representation fell below competence standards, we get a new trial. The appeals process was Byzantine. Book walked me through each step: direct appeals versus habeas corpus, petitions, procedural defaults versus substantive claims. The system is designed to exhaust you, he explained. They make it so complicated that most people give up, but you can't. Your life depends on it. I threw myself into legal research with desperate intensity. 8 hours daily in the library, reading cases, taking notes, learning appellate procedure. I studied requirements for ineffective assistance claims, standards for newly discovered evidence, rules governing prosecutorial misconduct. Other inmates thought I was crazy. Why waste time with that shit? Asked Walter. You got life without parole. But Book understood. He taught me to think like a lawyer, analyze cases for precedential value, craft arguments that would survive judicial scrutiny. My first brief was a disaster, all passion, describing injustice and pain. Book handed it back, frowning. This reads like a diary. You need to be clinical, dispassionate. Let facts speak. I rewrote it 6 times before Book approved the final 40-page brief, arguing Morrison's representation was constitutionally deficient. The response took 8 months. I tore open the envelope with shaking hands. The court denied my appeal in 3 pages that barely acknowledged my arguments. I sat in my cell that night, staring at the denial until words blurred. The dismissive language felt like another conviction. Book found me the next morning, head buried in hands. First appeal, he asked. I nodded. Good, now you're ready to learn how this really works. Book explained. The first appeal was rarely successful. Real work began with habeas corpus petitions, where we could raise claims not properly addressed at trial, where we could investigate Stephen's background, prove Morrison's inadequacy. But I don't have money for investigators. Then we get creative, use discovery to force document production, file motions to compel subpoenas for records, make them do the work. Over the next year, Book taught me to become my own investigator. We filed requests for Stephen's personnel records, training files, complaints. Most were denied, but each denial gave grounds for appeal. The work was tedious, often discouraging. For every small victory a document obtained, a witness located there, were dozens of setbacks, but Book kept me focused on the long game. This isn't about getting out tomorrow. This is about building a case so strong they can't ignore it. You're going to prove innocence through facts and law. The law books became constant companions. I carried them everywhere, studied until words burned into memory. Other inmates joked about the jailhouse lawyer, but I wore the title with pride. Knowledge was power. Book's faith never wavered, even when mine did. On bad days, when motions were denied or deadlines passed without progress, he reminded me why we fought. Innocent men don't belong in cages. Truth always finds a way to surface. We just have to be patient enough to wait. The divorce papers arrived on my second anniversary behind bars, tucked between a commissary statement and a letter from my aunt. Sarah's handwriting was familiar, but the words felt like they came from a stranger. I can't do this anymore, the letter began. I've tried to be strong, to wait for you, but I can't build my life around visiting someone in prison. I need to move on. The formal petition reduced our 3-year relationship to property divisions and We'd been engaged 6 months when I was arrested. Now she was dissolving our future with signatures and court filings. I couldn't blame her. 23 was too young to become a prison wife. But the finality hit harder than expected. My mother came that weekend, her face showing 2 years of strain. She'd aged dramatically gray, streaking her hair, lines deepening around her eyes. She worked 2 jobs now, cleaning offices at night and watching children during the day, to pay legal fees and put money in my commissary. I'm sorry about Sarah, she said through the prison phone. It's probably for the best. No, baby, it's not. You should be out there living your life, getting married, giving me grandchildren. Her voice broke. Visits with my mother were blessing and torture. She was my lifeline to the outside world, proof someone believed in my innocence, but I could see the toll how she was sacrificing her life to support mine. My father stopped visiting after the first year. He never said he thought I was guilty, but his absence spoke louder than words. When I asked about him, my mother made excuses, working extra shifts. Blood pressure problems, he'd come next time. Next time never came. The financial burden was crushing our family. She'd taken a second mortgage to pay Morrison's trial fees, cashed retirement savings for appeals. Visiting room conversations often turned to money, how much books help cost, whether we could afford an investigator, how long she could make payments. Maybe I should give up the appeals, I suggested once. Stop fighting and accept this. Her response was immediate and fierce. Don't you dare. I know you're innocent, and I'm going to keep fighting until everyone else knows it too. But I could see exhaustion in her eyes, shoulders sagging under the weight of supporting a son who might never come home. She was killing herself for me. My younger brother Marcus had distanced himself entirely. Starting college when I was convicted, the stigma of having a cop-killer brother made his life hell. Students whispered in hallways, professors treated him with suspicion, potential friends backed away learning his name. He changed his name. My mother told me quietly during one visit, he's going by Marcus Johnson now, your father's middle name. The news hit like a physical blow. My brother had erased our connection, changed his identity to escape my conviction's shadow. I understood why, but it felt like another death. The isolation was complete. Sarah building a new life. Father writing me off. Brother literally changing his name to avoid association. Only my mother remained, and her loyalty was slowly destroying her. The money ran out during my 3rd year. My mother came with tears and overdue bills. I lost the house, she said simply. I can't make payments anymore. The house where I'd grown up was gone. She was moving in with my aunt, sleeping on a couch at 52 because she'd spent everything trying to prove her son's innocence. Has to stop. You can't destroy your life from me. You're my son. This is what mothers do. But I could see her breaking. The strong woman who'd raised me was crumbling under my convictions. Wait, that night, I wrote a letter I never intended to send, telling my mother to let me go. Stop visiting, stop fighting. To rebuild her life and pretend she'd never had a son named Isaiah Carter. I wrote it, sealed it, then tore it up. Even though it would have been merciful, I couldn't bear losing the only person who still believed in me. My mother's faith was the only thing keeping me sane, even if it was killing her. Prison doesn't just punish the guilty, it destroys innocent families who refuse to abandon their loved ones. My conviction had victimized everyone who cared about me, and sometimes that felt like the cruelest punishment of all. Detective Maria Rodriguez's business card arrived with no return address. Slipped to me by a guard, paid $20 to deliver it. Simple white background, black text, her name and number. On the back, in careful handwriting, "I believe you." Stared at those words for hours. After 3 years of being called a liar, a killer, a monster, here was someone, a police detective, who believed my story. It felt too good to be true. Rodriguez called the next day, arranging a meeting under the pretense of discussing an unrelated cold case. She arrived Thursday afternoon, a small Latina woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and prematurely gray hair, simple pantsuit, worn leather briefcase showing years of police work. "I'm Detective Rodriguez, Metro PD Cold Case Division," she said. "I've been looking into your case." "Why?" "Because something doesn't add up. I've been a cop for 22 years, seen a lot of officer-involved incidents. Your case has details that don't make sense." Rodriguez had stumbled across my case while investigating excessive force complaints in the 3rd District's Devens area. She was looking into civil rights violations when she found Stevens' name in several incident reports. "Stevens had a problem," she said, sliding a document across the table. "Multiple excessive force complaints, 3 baton incidents, 2 alcohol-related disciplinary actions. His supervisors knew he was a loose cannon." My heart raced, reading the reports. Here was evidence Morrison should have found, background that would have changed everything at trial. Stevens wasn't the hero cop portrayed. He was troubled with a history of violence. Why wasn't this brought up at my trial? Because his file was sealed after his death. The department didn't want his record tarnishing his reputation. They classified everything as confidential personnel matters. Rodriguez specialized in cold cases where police misconduct might have played a role. She had a reputation for thoroughness and fearlessness in pursuing truth. "I'm not officially investigating your case," she said carefully. "The department would shut me down, but I've been looking into it on my own time, and I think you got railroaded." She'd spent months reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses not called at trial, researching Stevens' background. What emerged painted a picture of a corrupt officer, whose death was whitewashed to protect the department. Stevens was drinking on duty the night he died. His partner Bradley knew but covered for him. There's a whole culture of looking the other way. "Can you prove this?" "Some of it. I've got witnesses who saw Stevens drinking at Murphy's Bar 2 hours before shift's end. Records showing previous alcohol reprimands. Testimony from other officers about his violent tendencies." Rodriguez pulled out a photograph. Stevens drunk. At a bar, face flushed, eyes unfocused, dated 2 weeks before our confrontation. He had an escalating drinking problem, marriage falling apart, facing disciplinary action, looking for someone to take his anger out on. "You were wrong place, wrong time." Her investigation uncovered a pattern supporting my version. Stevens involved in 3 excessive force incidents. 6 months before his death, heavy drinking on and off duty. Supervisor had recommended counseling, but Stevens refused. "I believe he attacked you that night. I believe he was drunk, angry, looking for a fight. I believe you defended yourself and his death was accidental. What can we do? That's complicated. If the department finds out I'm investigating this, I could lose my job. But I can't watch an innocent man rot in prison." Rodriguez proposed a careful strategy. She'd continue her unofficial investigation, gathering evidence and building a case. When she had enough proof, she'd help me present it through proper legal channels. "This will take time, and there are no guarantees. The system doesn't like admitting mistakes, especially in high-profile cases. But for the first time in 3 years, I felt hope. Here was a professional investigator who understood the system, believed in my innocence, and was willing to fight for it." "Why are you doing this?" Rodriguez was quiet, gathering papers. "Because I became a cop to serve justice, not protect lies. If we can't trust the system to get it right, we have to fix it ourselves." She handed me her card again. "I'll be in touch." Don't give up hope. Detective Maria Rodriguez had become my advocate, my investigator, my link to truth. For the first time since conviction, I believed justice might still be possible. Stevens' personnel file was a roadmap of misconduct, documentation of a police officer's descent into corruption and violence. Detective Rodriguez spread the contents across the conference table like puzzle pieces, each document revealing another layer of conspiracy. "Look at this," Rodriguez said, pointing to a complaint 6 months before our confrontation. Maria Gonzalez, 22-year-old mother, claims Stevens beat her during a traffic stop, said he smelled like alcohol, and became violent when she questioned the stop. Internal Affairs dismissed the complaint as unsubstantiated, but Rodriguez had tracked down Gonzalez and interviewed her. The woman's story mirrored mine. Intoxicated Stevens, escalating a minor encounter into violence. She was too scared to pursue it. Single mother, undocumented, afraid of deportation. The department knew she wouldn't fight back. There were others. David Kim, a college student, claiming Stevens beat him with a flashlight. Jennifer Walsh, a prostitute, saying Stevens assaulted her to avoid arrest. Robert Turner, a homeless veteran, accusing Stevens of excessive force during a wellness check. All complaints dismissed or buried. All described the same pattern: an intoxicated, violent officer targeting vulnerable people who couldn't fight back. Stevens was a predator, Rodriguez said. He targeted people who wouldn't be believed, couldn't afford lawyers, wouldn't pursue complaints. The personnel file showed an officer spiraling out of control. Stevens written up for intoxication 3 times his final year. Failed 2 psychological evaluations. Training supervisor recommended administrative leave pending counseling. Instead of addressing the problem, the department covered it up. Supervisors buried complaints, minimized disciplinary actions, allowed him to continue patrolling while drunk and violent. They knew, Rodriguez said, tapping a memo from Stevens' sergeant. They knew he was dangerous and did nothing. The memo, dated 3 weeks before Stevens' death, casually acknowledged his problems. Officer Stevens continues struggling with alcohol-related issues. Recommend continued monitoring and possible employee assistance program referral. Continued monitoring, not suspension, not treatment, not removal from duty, just monitoring while Stevens brutalized citizens. Rodriguez had been methodical, tracking witnesses, interviewing former colleagues, piecing together Stevens' decline. What emerged was institutional failure, department more concerned with reputation than public safety. The cover-up started immediately, Rodriguez explained, showing emails between officials. Within hours, they were crafting the heroic officer narrative. The emails revealed coordinated evidence suppression. Stevens' file, sealed, complaints reclassified as confidential, witnesses discouraged from coming forward. Look at this, Rodriguez pointed to an email from the police union president. We need to ensure Stevens' legacy isn't tarnished. The family deserves better than having their reputation destroyed by some cop killer's lies. The union provided legal support to suppress evidence and lobby for quick conviction. They hired investigators to dig up dirt on me, finding my high school fight and turning it into evidence of violent nature. The investigation was one-sided from the beginning. Resources poured into building a case against me, while no one investigated. Stevens questioned the official narrative. Rodriguez also uncovered corruption beyond Stevens. His partner Bradley lied about Stevens' condition. The sergeant falsified the incident report. The union representative coordinated with the DA office to suppress evidence. It goes to the top. The chief knew about Stevens' problems. The mayor knew about complaints. The DA knew the case was shaky, but they all had reasons for quick conviction. The chief faced criticism for rising crime, needed a victory. The mayor was running for re-election, couldn't afford scandal. The DA was building her career on conviction rates. You were sacrificed for their careers. An innocent man sent to prison so they could look good to voters. But Rodriguez's investigation revealed cracks in their conspiracy. Bradley struggling with guilt. 2 officers expressing doubts. A crime scene technician noticing discrepancies. Never addressed. People are starting to talk. The lies are getting harder to maintain. She'd been working sources carefully, applying pressure, offering protection to those willing to come forward. Dangerous work investigating her own department, challenging powerful people with much to lose. I've been transferred twice since starting this. Different divisions, different assignments. They're trying to shut me down without making it obvious. But Rodriguez was determined. She'd documented everything, created backups, prepared for being forced off the case. I won't let them bury the truth. Too many people have suffered for their lies. As our meeting ended, Rodriguez gathered files, but their contents were burned into my memory. For the first time, I had proof of what I'd always known: Stevens was corrupt and violent. His death, the result of his own actions. How long before? We can present this soon. I'm working on getting one of Stevens' colleagues to testify about his drinking. Once I have that, we'll have enough for a new trial motion. She paused at the door. Isaiah, this evidence doesn't just prove you're innocent, it exposes corruption at the heart of the police department. When this comes out, people will do anything to stop it. What are you saying? Be careful, watch your back. The people who buried this evidence once won't hesitate to silence you permanently. The truth was emerging, but the conspirators were far from powerless. My fight for freedom was about to become much more dangerous. The body camera footage was our smoking gun, buried in police archives like a time bomb. Detective Rodriguez found it during her 4th year of investigation, hidden in a mislabeled file that escaped systematic evidence destruction. I almost missed it, Rodriguez told me during our library meeting. Labeled as training footage from another officer, wrong date. But the file size made me curious. She'd spent hours analyzing digital records, cross-referencing equipment logs, with officer assignments, looking for overlooked evidence. The breakthrough came discovering Stevens wore a body camera that Knight never mentioned during my trial. The department claimed it malfunctioned, said it failed to record, just bad. Look, but I found maintenance records his camera was working perfectly. The cover-up was sophisticated. Footage downloaded within hours of Stevens' death, moved to secure servers, mislabeled to make it impossible to find. Original equipment logs, altered showing a non-existent malfunction. Someone with high-level access orchestrated this, not just a beat cop covering for his partner. This was planned, systematic evidence destruction. Getting access required Rodriguez to use every contact from 20 years of police work. She called in favors, made promises, took enormous risks to obtain what should have been public evidence. "I can't tell you how I got it," she said, sliding a flash drive across the table, "but you need to watch it first before we decide how to proceed." The prison librarian, Trustee Eddie, who'd been helping my research, arranged computer access after hours. With trembling hands, I inserted the drive and opened the video. The footage was crystal clear, high definition with perfect audio. It began with Stevens walking toward the alley, breathing heavy and irregular. Within seconds, it was obvious. He was intoxicated in steady gait, erratic movements. "Fucking night shift," Stevens muttered, words slurred. "Need to find someone to fuck with?" The audio captured my footsteps before Stevens spotted me. When he called out, his voice was aggressive from the beginning, camera showing him reaching for his baton before I'd even turned around. The footage captured everything: Stevens' intoxication, immediate escalation to violence, lies about drug complaints. Most damning, it showed him attacking me first, striking with his baton while I tried to comply. "You're lying to me," Stevens said, voice thick with alcohol and rage. "I know you're dealing." When I insisted I had no drugs, Stevens responded, "You think you're smart? I'll beat the truth out of you." The first blow was clearly visible, striking my ribs while I stood with raised hands. The second hit my shoulder, camera mic picking up bone cracking. Stevens was breathing heavily, face twisted with rage, having nothing to do with law enforcement. "Fight back," Stevens taunted, raising the baton for a killing blow. "Come on, resist arrest. Give me a reason." The struggle was brief but vicious. Camera captured my desperate attempt to disarm Stevens, our fight for the weapon, his reach for his gun. It showed us crashing into the wall together, Stevens' head striking brick with sickening impact. Most importantly, footage showed truth. This was self-defense. I was fighting for my life against a drunk, violent officer trying to beat me to death for twisted pleasure. Recording continued several minutes after Stevens fell, capturing my shock and horror. It showed me checking for a pulse, hands shaking, realizing he was dead. It recorded my panicked flight but also genuine distress and terror. "Jesus Christ," I whispered, watching myself on screen. After 4 years, I was seeing objective proof of what happened. When Rodriguez returned, I was still processing the emotional impact. "Now you understand why they buried it. This video destroys their narrative completely. Proves Stevens was drunk, violent, lying. Proves you defended yourself against unprovoked attack." Rodriguez had also discovered technical evidence proving deliberate suppression. Digital timestamps showed the video accessed multiple times after Stevens' death, then moved to restricted storage. Someone in digital forensics helped with the cover-up. They altered equipment logs, created false malfunction reports, hid evidence where it couldn't be found. The implications were staggering, not just prosecutorial misconduct or police incompetence. The emergency motion for new trial was our legal weapon. 47 pages of facts and law that would either free me or damn me forever. Attorney Rebecca Morrison, no relation to my former public defender, had taken my case pro bono after Rodriguez approached her with the suppressed evidence. Morrison was a fierce civil rights lawyer with a reputation for taking on impossible cases and winning. "This is the strongest wrongful conviction case I've ever seen," Morrison told me during our first meeting. She was a sharp woman in her 40s, with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. "We have video evidence of police misconduct, documented proof of evidence, suppression, and a pattern of institutional corruption. The question isn't whether you're innocent, it's whether we can overcome 4 years of lies." Morrison had assembled a team of experts to support our motion. Digital forensics specialists analyzed the body camera footage and confirmed it was authentic and unedited. Former FBI agents examined the evidence, suppression, and identified criminal violations. Police procedure experts reviewed Stevens' actions and concluded they violated every standard of professional conduct. "The prosecution is going to fight this with everything they have," Morrison warned. "Your conviction made careers, and your exoneration will destroy them. Expect a scorched earth response." The motion was filed on a Tuesday morning in November, and by that afternoon the legal warfare had begun. District Attorney Rebecca Walsh, now a judge with political ambitions, immediately filed a response, claiming the new evidence was fabricated. The police union issued a statement calling the body camera footage a desperate hoax by a convicted cop killer. "They're panicking," Morrison said, reviewing the prosecution's hasty response. "Look at this, they're making arguments that contradict their own trial testimony. They're claiming Stevens couldn't have been intoxicated because he was a professional, but their own witness testified he'd been working a double shift." The media coverage was intense and divided. Progressive outlets that had always questioned police misconduct treated the footage as vindication of their skepticism. Conservative media that had championed law and order dismissed it as an elaborate fraud. The story became a political litmus test. With opinions split along predictable lines, Rodriguez found herself under immediate investigation. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry into her unauthorized investigation and placed her on administrative leave. Her phone was monitored, her computer was seized, and colleagues were instructed not to speak with her. "They're trying to discredit the messenger," Morrison explained. "If they can paint Rodriguez as a rogue cop with an agenda, they can cast doubt on everything she's discovered." But Rodriguez had anticipated this response. She'd documented every step of her investigation, maintained detailed records of her sources, and created backup copies of all evidence. When Internal Affairs demanded her files, she produced a paper trail that demonstrated the thoroughness and professionalism of her work. The prosecution's strategy became clear in their amended response to our motion. They claimed the body camera footage was authentic but irrelevant, arguing that Stevens' intoxication didn't justify my actions. They maintained that a police officer has the right to use force to effect an arrest, regardless of his condition. "It's a desperate argument," Morrison said, "but it shows how far they're willing to go to protect their narrative." The prosecution also attacked the chain of custody for the evidence, claiming that Rodriguez had obtained it illegally and that it should be excluded from consideration. They demanded an investigation into how the footage was accessed, and suggested that evidence tampering might have occurred. Morrison countered with a motion for sanctions against the prosecution, arguing that they had deliberately suppressed evidence in violation of their constitutional obligations. She demanded access to all files related to Stevens' case, including internal communications about the evidence suppression. "We're not just asking for a new trial," Morrison explained. "We're asking the court to acknowledge prosecutorial misconduct and police corruption. That's a much bigger ask." The hearing was scheduled for December. The court transcript would become a historical document, an official record of truth finally spoken after 4 years of lies. December 15, 2020, the day my life hung in the balance of Judge Patricia Hawkins' decision. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. I sat at the defense table in my best suit, the same one my mother had bought for my original trial. It still fit, though prison had changed my body and my face. Rebecca Morrison sat beside me, her confidence reassuring, but not enough to calm my racing heart. Judge Hawkins entered promptly at 9 a.m., her black robes rustling as she took her seat. She was a severe woman in her 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen decades of courtroom drama. She'd sentenced me to life 4 years ago. Today, she might set me free. "We are here today on defendant's motion for new trial based on newly discovered evidence," Judge Hawkins began. "This is an extraordinary remedy that requires extraordinary proof. Counsel, proceed." Morrison rose from her chair with the dignity of someone who knew she was fighting for justice. "Your Honor, 4 years ago this court sentenced Isaiah Carter to life in prison based on lies, suppressed evidence, and prosecutorial misconduct. Today, we present overwhelming proof of Mr. Carter's innocence and demand that this conviction be overturned." The prosecution table was crowded with Attorney Walsh had assembled a team of prosecutors to defend their conviction. Their lead counsel, Assistant DA Michael Chang, was a sharp young lawyer with a reputation for ruthless tactics. Morrison's opening was masterful, laying out the evidence methodically and building toward the bombshell of the body camera footage. She called Detective Rodriguez as her first witness, and despite the harassment she'd endured, Rodriguez testified with calm professionalism. "I discovered a pattern of misconduct by Officer Stevens that was systematically covered up by the police department," Rodriguez testified. "Multiple complaints of excessive force, documented alcohol abuse, and a history of targeting vulnerable citizens." Chang's cross-examination was brutal, attacking Rodriguez's motives and methods. "Detective, isn't it true that you conducted this investigation without authorization from your superiors?" "I investigated because I believed an innocent man was in prison," Rodriguez replied steadily. "And isn't it true that you've been under investigation for improper conduct related to this case?" "I've been harassed and intimidated for uncovering the truth," Rodriguez shot back. Morrison's next witness was Dr. Patricia Williams, a digital forensics expert who had analyzed the body camera footage. Her testimony was technical but devastating, confirming that the video was authentic and had been deliberately suppressed. The metadata shows this footage was accessed multiple times after Officer Stevens' death, then moved to secure storage with restricted access. Dr. Williams testified, "This was not a malfunction, this was deliberate evidence suppression." The courtroom was silent as Morrison introduced the body camera footage as evidence. "Your Honor, I ask that the courtroom be cleared of media and spectators for the release papers were crisp white documents that gave back a stolen life, signed by Judge Hawkins with what I imagined was a heavy heart. After 7 years, 3 months, and 12 days, I walked out of Riverside State Penitentiary as a free man." The media circus was immediate and overwhelming. Reporters shouted questions I couldn't process. Camera flashes exploded in my face like fireworks. Rebecca Morrison guided me through the crowd, her hand on my shoulder steady and protective. "How does it feel to be free?" someone yelled. "What will you do now?" another voice called out. I couldn't answer. 7 years of prison had prepared me for violence, isolation, and despair. It hadn't prepared me for freedom. My mother was waiting by Morrison's car, tears streaming down her face. She looked so much older than I remembered, gray hair now completely white, lines etched deep by years of fighting for my freedom. When she hugged me, I felt how small she'd become, how the fight had diminished her. I knew this day would come, she whispered against my chest. I never stopped believing. The ride home to my aunt's house where my mother now lived was surreal. The city had changed in 7 years. New buildings, different shops, technology I didn't recognize. I felt like a time traveler, displaced and disoriented. Your father wants to see you, my mother said carefully as we drove. He's been carrying a lot of guilt about not visiting. I nodded but didn't respond. 7 years of absence couldn't be erased by a conversation, no matter how sincere. The adjustment to freedom was harder than I'd expected. Simple decisions what to eat, where to go, how to spend my time felt overwhelming after years of rigid prison routine. I woke up at 5 a.m. out of habit, looked for guards who weren't there, listened for count that never came. My brother Marcus Now Johnson came to see me 3 days after my release. He was 25 now, a college graduate working in finance. He looked like our father, serious and reserved. I'm sorry I changed my name, he said. I was young and scared. I understand, I replied, though part of me still felt the sting of abandonment. I want to change it back now, if that's okay with you. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. My family was slowly reassembling itself, trying to heal wounds that had festered for 7 years. The world had moved on without me. Technology I didn't understand, social media platforms that hadn't existed when I went to prison, cultural references that sailed over my head. I felt like an alien visiting Earth, struggling to learn its customs. But the hardest part was the guilt, not guilt for Stephen's death. I made peace with that necessity. Guilt for what my conviction had cost my family. My mother's house, her retirement savings, her health, my father's shame and distance, my brother's identity crisis, 7 years of collateral damage that could never be fully repaired. Sarah had married 2 years after our divorce, had a daughter, built the life I'd stolen from her through no fault of my own. I saw her at the grocery store one afternoon, pushing a cart with a toddler who had her eyes. She saw me too, offered a sad smile and a small wave. We didn't speak what was there to say. The financial compensation would come later, after civil lawsuits and settlements. But money couldn't buy back 7 years of my 20s. Couldn't restore my mother's health. Couldn't undo the trauma of wrongful imprisonment. I struggled with anger that burned in my chest like acid. Anger at Stevens for starting the chain of events that destroyed my life. Anger at Morrison for her inadequate defense. Anger at the prosecutors and police who conspired to hide the truth. Anger at a system that had failed so completely. But anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. It would poison whatever life I had left. Destroy relationships I was trying to rebuild. Dr. Sarah Williamson, the therapist Morrison had connected me with, helped me understand that healing required letting go of rage. You survived something that would have broken most people, she told me during one session. The question now is, what kind of life do you want to build with the time you have left? I started community college again, picking up where I'd left off 7 years earlier. The other students were younger, their concerns foreign to me, but the structure of learning, the pursuit of knowledge, felt familiar and comforting. Detective Rodriguez visited me at my mother's house, bringing pizza and updates on the continuing investigation. 3 officers had been indicted for evidence tampering. The former DA was facing federal charges, and the police chief had resigned in disgrace. Your case broke it all wide open, she said. Dozens of convictions are being reviewed. Evidence protocols have been overhauled. The whole department is under federal oversight. It was some comfort knowing that my suffering had prevented others from experiencing the same injustice, but it couldn't give me back the years I'd lost. The release papers that had seemed so precious on the day of my freedom were just documents now, filed away in a drawer with other important paperwork. Freedom wasn't a moment, it was a process, a daily choice to rebuild and move forward despite everything that had been taken from me. I was 28 years old and starting over, carrying the weight of 7 stolen years, but also the knowledge that I'd survived the system's worst betrayal. That had to count for something. Asterisk. The lawsuit filing was our declaration of war against the system that had destroyed my life. A federal civil rights case seeking damages for 7 years of wrongful imprisonment. Morrison had assembled a team of civil rights attorneys who specialized in police misconduct cases, and they were hungry for justice. This isn't just about money, Morrison explained as we reviewed the 200-page complaint. This is about accountability. We're going to expose every person who participated in this conspiracy, and make sure it never happens again. The defendants read like a who's who of the city's power structure, the police department, the district attorney's office, individual officers and prosecutors, even the mayor's office for their role in covering up Stephen's misconduct. We were suing everyone who had played a part in burying the truth. The city's initial response was predictable denial, deflection, and delay. Their lawyers filed motion after motion trying to get the case dismissed, claiming immunity for government officials and arguing that the statute of limitations had expired. They're scared, Morrison said after reviewing their filings. These motions are desperate attempts to avoid trial. They know what happens when all this evidence gets presented to a jury. The discovery process was a revelation, forcing the city to turn over documents they'd hidden for years. We obtained emails between prosecutors and police officials coordinating the cover-up, budget records showing money spent on private investigators to discredit me, and personnel files documenting the systematic protection of bad cops. One email chain was particularly damning, a conversation between the former DA and police chief about managing the narrative after Stevens' death. They discussed strategies for suppressing evidence and ensuring a quick conviction to avoid scrutiny of the department. "We need to wrap this up fast," the DA had written. "The longer it drags out, the more likely someone starts asking uncomfortable questions about Stevens." The city offered an early settlement, $2 million, and a promise of police reforms. It was a substantial amount, but Morrison advised against accepting. "They're hoping to buy your silence," she said. $2 million sounds like a lot, but considering what they stole from you, it's insulting. And more importantly, taking their money means no trial, no public accountability. I wanted the trial. Money couldn't restore my 20s or heal my family's trauma, but exposing the truth publicly might prevent other innocent people from suffering the same fate. The opposition's strategy became clear as depositions began. They painted Stevens as a flawed but fundamentally good officer whose death was tragic regardless of the circumstances. They portrayed the cover-up as misguided loyalty rather than criminal conspiracy. These were good people making bad decisions under pressure, their lead attorney argued during one hearing. Nobody intended for an innocent man to go to prison, but the evidence told a different story. Digital forensics experts testified about the sophisticated nature of the evidence suppression. Former officers broke their silence about the culture of corruption in the department. Even Bradley, Stevens' former partner, finally admitted he'd lied about Stevens' condition that night. "I knew he was drunk," Bradley testified during his deposition, "but we were told to stick to the story about him responding to a drug complaint. I was young, scared of losing my job. I know that's not an excuse." The personal toll of the lawsuit was exhausting. Reliving the trauma through depositions and document review reopened wounds I was trying to heal. But Morrison and her team were relentless in their pursuit of accountability. "Every email we obtain, every witness we depose, builds the case for other victims." Morrison reminded me, "Your suffering is helping people you'll never meet." Detective Rodriguez's role in uncovering the truth made her a star witness, but it also made her a target. The city tried to discredit her testimony by highlighting her unauthorized investigation and suggesting she was motivated by anti-police bias. Detective Rodriguez is a 20-year veteran with an exemplary record, Morrison countered. "The only thing she's biased against is corruption and injustice." As trial approached, the city's settlement offers increased $5 million, then $8, then $12. Each offer came with strict confidentiality agreements that would have prevented me from discussing the case publicly. "They're terrified of a jury trial," Morrison explained. "A jury might award much more than $12 million, but more importantly, a trial means weeks of testimony about police corruption broadcast on every news channel." The case attracted national attention, with civil rights organizations and legal scholars filing amicus briefs supporting our claims. My story became a symbol of everything wrong with the criminal justice system: prosecutorial misconduct, police corruption, and the willingness to sacrifice innocent lives to protect institutional interests. 3 weeks before trial, the city made their final offer, $15 million, and a consent decree requiring comprehensive police reforms. Overseen by a federal monitor, "It's a good offer," Morrison said. "More money than most wrongful conviction settlements, and real reforms that could prevent future cases like yours." I thought about Book, still in prison, who'd taught me to navigate the legal system. About Tommy and the other inmates I'd left behind, some guilty, but others who might be innocent. About my mother, who'd sacrificed everything for my freedom and deserved some compensation for her losses. "I'll take it," I decided. "But I want to make a statement when we announce the settlement. I want people to understand what happened here." The lawsuit filing that had started as a demand for justice became something larger, a catalyst for reform and accountability. $15 million couldn't buy back 7 years of my life, but it could help ensure that other innocent people wouldn't suffer the same fate. The system that had tried to bury me was finally being held accountable. Stevens' autopsy report was the final piece of evidence that vindicated me. Clinical documentation of the injuries that proved I'd acted in self-defense. But reading it 8 years after his death brought unexpected emotions, not vindication, but a complex mixture of sadness and closure. Blunt force trauma to the occipital region, consistent with impact against a hard surface. The report stated in cold medical terminology, blood alcohol content of 0.08, evidence of chronic alcohol abuse, including liver damage. The man who'd tried to kill me had been slowly killing himself with alcohol, using his badge to hurt people, while his own life fell apart. It didn't excuse his actions, but it helped me understand them. I decided to visit Stephen's grave on a gray Tuesday morning, driving to Riverside Cemetery with flowers I'd bought at a gas station. I wasn't sure why I felt compelled to go, maybe to say goodbye to the man whose death had defined my 20s. Or maybe to confront the guilt I still carried, despite knowing I'd had no choice. The headstone was simple black granite. James Stephens, beloved husband and father, 1979 to 2016. Fresh flowers suggested his family still visited regularly. I placed my bouquet beside theirs and stood in silence, trying to find words for a conversation I'd never expected to have. "I'm sorry your life ended that night," I finally said. "I'm sorry for your family's pain, but I'm not sorry for defending myself." A voice behind me made me turn. "You must be Isaiah Carter." A woman in her 40s stood a few feet away, wearing a simple black dress and carrying lilies. She had Stephen's eyes deep blue and intense in his stubborn jawline. This was his widow, Catherine Stephens. "Mrs. Stephens," I said, unsure whether to stay or leave. "I didn't know you were coming." "I come every Tuesday," she replied, moving to stand beside the grave. "I saw the news about your exoneration, about the body camera footage." We stood in awkward silence, the victim and the widow, brought together by tragedy and truth. I expected anger, accusations, blame. Instead, Catherine Stephens surprised me. "I knew something was wrong with him," she said quietly. "The drinking, the anger, the way he came home some nights." I begged him to get help. "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it despite everything. "Are you?" she asked, not accusingly but with genuine curiosity. "He tried to kill you. The footage proves that." I considered the question carefully. "I'm sorry he died. I'm sorry for the pain his death caused you and your children. But I'm not sorry for surviving." Catherine nodded slowly. "I've watched that footage dozens of times. I've seen what my husband became. The man in that video wasn't the person I married." She told me about their marriage, how Stephens had started drinking heavily after a shooting incident 3 years before his death, how he'd become increasingly violent and paranoid, how she'd considered leaving him but stayed for their children's sake. The department knew he had problems, but did nothing, she said. "They're as responsible for his death as anyone. If they'd gotten him help instead of covering for him, he might still be alive." Her words were both accusation and absolution. Stephen's death was the result of institutional failure, as much as individual choice, a system that protected bad cops until they destroyed themselves and innocent people. "I wanted to hate you," Catherine admitted. "For 8 years I told my children their father died a hero, killed by a criminal. Learning the truth has been devastating, but also liberating." She pulled an envelope from her purse and handed it to me. "This is from my daughter Emma. She's 16 now, graduating high school next month." The letter was written in careful teenage script. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry my father hurt you. I'm sorry the police lied about what happened. I'm glad you're free now. I hope you can forgive him, and maybe someday forgive me for believing their lies about you." I felt tears running down my cheeks as I read Emma's words. This girl had lost her father and then learned he was nothing like the hero she'd believed him to be. Her pain was collateral damage, just like my family's suffering. "Tell Emma she has nothing to apologize for," I said. "None of this was her fault." Catherine reached into her purse again and pulled out Stephen's police badge, the same one his widow had worn to my trial 8 years earlier. "I want you to have this," she said, holding it out to me. I stared at the badge, uncertain. "Why?" "Because you're the only person who knew my husband's last truth," she replied. "The man in that video was destroyed by alcohol and unchecked power. Maybe keeping his badge will remind you that police officers are human beings who can fall. As far as anyone." I took the badge, feeling its weight in my palm. It was heavier than I'd expected, worn smooth by years of wear. On the back, someone had engraved "Protect and Serve," words that had become a mockery in Stephen's hands. "What will you do now?" Catherine asked. "Try to prevent this from happening to other people," I said. "Work for criminal justice reform. Support other wrongfully convicted individuals." "That's good," she said. "Use what happened to you to help others. That gives meaning to all this pain." As we prepared to leave, Catherine turned back to me. "Isaiah, I need you to know something. I don't blame you for my husband's death. I blame the system that failed him, failed you, failed all of us." Driving home with Stephen's badge in my pocket, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not happiness, not vindication, but a quiet acceptance of what had happened and what came next. The autopsy report had provided medical truth about Stephen's death, but the conversation with his widow had provided something more valuable: human truth about forgiveness, understanding, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. Stephens was dead because he'd chosen to drink, chosen to abuse his power, chosen to attack an innocent man, but he was also dead because a system had failed to help him when he needed it most. That failure was something I could work to prevent in the future. The man who'd tried to kill me was gone, but the lessons of his death and mine would live on. The speaking engagement program brochure featured my photograph alongside the title "From Wrongful Conviction to Criminal Justice Reform." 2 years after my release, I'd found my calling as an advocate for others. Trapped in the system's failures, my new life was built around speaking truth to power. I testified before legislative committees about prosecutorial misconduct, spoke at law schools about the importance of thorough defense work, and counseled families struggling with loved ones' wrongful convictions. The National Registry of had documented over 3,000 wrongful convictions since 1989, and those were just the cases where innocence could be proven. How many other Isaiah Carters were sitting in cells? Their evidence buried, their voices silenced. I partnered with the Innocence Project on cases with similarities to mine: police misconduct, prosecutorial overreach, evidence suppression. My settlement money funded a small foundation that provided resources for investigations and legal challenges in cases where public defenders were overwhelmed. You have credibility that lawyers and activists don't, explained Dr. Jennifer Martinez, director of the Criminal Justice Reform Institute, where I'd become a fellow. When you speak about systemic failures, people listen because you've lived them. My first major speaking engagement was at the annual Conference of Defense Attorneys. Standing at the podium, looking out at hundreds of lawyers, I felt the weight of responsibility. 7 years of my life were stolen by prosecutors who cared more about conviction rates than truth, by police who protected their own rather than serve justice, by a system that values expedience over accuracy. I told them, "You are the last line of defense between innocent people and wrongful conviction. That's not just a job, it's a sacred trust." The response was overwhelming. Attorneys approached me afterward with their own stories of prosecutorial misconduct, evidence, suppression, and institutional pressure to accept plea deals rather than fight for clients. The problems that had destroyed my life were endemic. Rebecca Morrison had become more than my lawyer. She was a mentor and collaborator in reform efforts. Together, we drafted model legislation requiring body cameras for all police interactions, mandatory disclosure of officer misconduct records, and independent investigation of police shootings. Change is slow, Morrison reminded me during one of our strategy sessions, but your case has become a catalyst. Police departments across the country are reviewing their evidence protocols because of what happened to you. My relationship with Detective Rodriguez had evolved into deep friendship. She'd left the police force after facing retaliation for her investigation, but found new purpose as a private investigator specializing in wrongful conviction cases. "I couldn't stay in a system that punished truth-telling," she explained over coffee, "but I can use my skills to help other people who've been failed by that system." Rodriguez and I worked together on cold cases, reviewing evidence and interviewing witnesses that overworked public defenders had missed. We'd helped overturn 2 convictions in the past year, with 3 more cases pending. The personal rebuilding was harder than the professional advocacy. I'd started dating again carefully, slowly, with women who understood that 7 years in prison had left me with trust issues and PTSD that required ongoing therapy. My relationship with my family had healed but bore permanent scars. My father and I spoke regularly now, both of us carrying guilt about the years of silence. My brother had legally changed his name back to Carter and visited monthly, bringing his new girlfriend to family dinners. My mother was my greatest source of pride and pain. She'd developed diabetes and high blood pressure during my incarceration, stress-related conditions that were slowly stealing her health, but she was also my biggest supporter, attending my speaking engagements and proudly introducing herself as Isaiah's mother to anyone who would listen. "I always knew this day would come," she'd say after my speeches. "I knew you'd turn your pain into purpose." Book remained in prison, his own appeals exhausted years ago. I visited him monthly, bringing legal research and funding private investigators to review his case. His murder conviction was solid. He'd killed a man during a drug deal gone wrong, but the circumstances suggested self-defense that was never adequately explored. "Even if I never get out," Book told me during one visit, "knowing you made it gives meaning to all those hours we spent in the law library. You're living proof that the system can be beaten." The work was emotionally exhausting but spiritually necessary. Every wrongful conviction case I worked on reminded me of my own trauma, triggered memories of sitting in that cell believing I would die in prison, but it also reminded me why the fight mattered. I testified before Congress about the need for federal oversight of local prosecutors' offices, sharing my story with senators who'd never considered how political ambition could corrupt the pursuit of justice. "I'm not here because I'm special," I told them. "I'm here because I was lucky enough to have a detective willing to risk her career for truth, lawyers willing to work for justice rather than money, and a family that never gave up. Most wrongfully convicted people don't have those advantages." The speaking engagement program had grown beyond my individual story to become a platform for systemic change. I shared stages with other exonerees, families of victims of police violence, and reform advocates working to fix the broken pieces of American justice. Each speaking engagement ended the same way, with my contact information and an offer to help anyone facing similar struggles. My inbox filled daily with messages from prisoners claiming innocence, families seeking advice, lawyers looking for support on difficult cases. I couldn't help everyone, but I could help some. And each person helped was a victory against the system that had tried to destroy me. The brochure that advertised my speaking engagements was more than promotional material. It was proof that survival was possible, that justice could be delayed but not permanently denied, that even the most crushing system failures could be transformed into forces for positive change. My life's work had become ensuring that no other innocent person would suffer as I had, that no other family would sacrifice everything for a loved one's freedom, that no other Detective Rodriguez would risk her career to uncover buried truth. The system had stolen 7 years of my life, but I was using the rest of my years to steal back a little justice for others. The Memorial Garden dedication was held on a crisp October morning, exactly 10 years after that night in the alley that changed everything. The bronze plaque read simply, Justice Garden. In memory of lives lost to system failures, and in honor of those who fight for truth, I stood before the small crowd gathered for the dedication. Exonerees, family members, reform advocates, and city officials who'd opposed us for years but now claimed to support transparency. The garden was modest flowering trees, stone benches, and walking paths, but it represented something larger than its physical boundaries. This garden is not a monument to my suffering or anyone else's, I said, addressing the crowd. It's a commitment to the future, a promise that we'll never stop fighting for truth, even when truth is inconvenient or uncomfortable. Mayor Patricia Williams, who'd replaced the mayor complicit in my case's spoke about the city's commitment to reform. Police Chief Maria Santos, the first Latina woman to hold the position, outlined new accountability measures. District Attorney Michael Chen, elected on a platform of prosecutorial reform, announced the creation of a conviction review unit. Their words were encouraging, but I'd learned not to trust promises from politicians. Real change came from sustained pressure, vigilant oversight, and the courage of individuals willing to speak truth to power. Detective Rodriguez sat in the front row, now running her own private investigation firm, specializing in wrongful conviction cases. She'd become one of the most respected investigators in the country, her work helping to overturn dozens of wrongful convictions. The book had been released 6 months earlier after new evidence emerged in his case, uncovered by the team of investigators my foundation had funded. At 63, he was too old to rebuild his life completely, but he'd found purpose teaching legal research to other inmates through video conferences. My mother sat beside him, now 72, and using a wheelchair due to complications from her diabetes. Her health had never fully recovered from the stress of my case, but her spirit remained unbroken. She'd become a fierce advocate for families of the wrongfully convicted, understanding their pain in ways that only someone who'd lived it could. My son's story isn't unique, she often told support groups. It's just one of thousands of families torn apart by a system that values winning over truth. But every story like his that gets told makes it harder for the next family to be ignored. The garden dedication attracted media attention, but I was no longer interested in being famous for surviving injustice. My focus had shifted to preventing future injustices, to building systems that protected the innocent instead of sacrificing them. The foundation I'd established with my settlement money had grown beyond my wildest expectations. Major donors had contributed millions more, allowing us to fund investigators, provide legal support, and lobby for legislative reforms in dozens of states. We'd helped overturn 37 wrongful convictions in 3 years, prevented countless others through early intervention, and supported hundreds of families navigating the nightmare of having an innocent loved one in prison. The goal isn't to handle more cases, I explained to our board of directors. It's to make these cases unnecessary by fixing the broken systems that create them in the first place. The most meaningful changes were often the smallest ones: a prosecutor's office implementing new evidence protocols, a police department requiring body cameras for all interactions, a public defender's office hiring additional staff to handle caseloads. My speaking engagements had evolved beyond simply telling my story. I now spoke about systemic solutions, evidence-based reforms, and the importance of accountability at every level of the justice system. The system didn't fail me by accident, I would tell audiences. It failed me because failing me was easier than admitting Officer Stevens was corrupt, easier than acknowledging prosecutorial misconduct, easier than confronting institutional racism. The question isn't how to prevent accidents, it's how to make truth-telling the path of least resistance. As the garden dedication ceremony concluded, people approached me with their own stories. A mother whose son had been wrongfully convicted of rape, a father whose daughter was serving life for a murder she didn't commit, a brother whose sibling had been killed by police under suspicious circumstances. I listened to each story, took contact information, made promises to review cases. The work would never end because the system's capacity for failure seemed limitless, but so did the human capacity for resilience, hope, and the pursuit of justice. That evening, I sat alone in the memorial garden as darkness fell. The bronze plaque caught the light from a nearby street lamp, its words barely visible in the growing dusk. I thought about the 21-year-old college student who'd walked down that alley 10 years ago, innocent of everything except bad timing. That young man couldn't have imagined the nightmare that awaited him 7 years in prison, a family destroyed by legal fees and trauma, a life derailed by institutional failure, but he also couldn't have imagined the purpose that would emerge from that suffering, the lives that would be saved by the advocacy born from his pain, the systemic changes that would result from his refusal to accept injustice. Stevens was dead, his legacy complicated by both his heroism as a young officer and his corruption in his final years. The prosecutors and police officials who'd conspired to hide the truth had faced various consequences, some criminal charges, others simply career destruction and public shame. But the real legacy of that night wasn't about individual punishment or vindication. It was about the hundreds of innocent people who would never be wrongfully convicted because of the reforms that followed, the thousands of families who had never experienced the trauma mine had endured. I stood up from the bench and walked toward the garden's entrance, where my car waited to take me home to my wife Serenat, my former fiancée, but a woman I'd met through the reform movement who understood that healing from trauma was a lifelong process. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new stories of injustice, new opportunities to fight for truth. The memorial garden would remain a quiet testament to the belief that even the most crushing system failures could be transformed into forces for positive change. The truth had taken 10 years to fully emerge, but emerge it had, and as long as people were willing to fight for it, truth would continue to surface, continue to drive reform, continue to demand that we build a justice system worthy of its name. Some fights are worth winning, no matter how long they take.